One of the reasons why I really enjoy being at Krannert and why I was attracted here is because of the excellent PhD program in strategic management, which has a great legacy. It is actually the oldest independent PhD program in strategic management anywhere on earth, and has a lot of great alumni, and it's great to be part of that program. And so I have really enjoyed over the last 4.5 years working with numerous really excellent doctoral students on some really fun and exciting projects. And the two projects I'm going to present today are examples of that. They're two projects very closely linked together that I did with a former doctoral student here, Kubilai Zhirek, who is now on the faculty at Louisiana State University. Yeah, it's just, we'll see. I'm going to try to present two papers. I don't know if I'll be able to do that in the time allotted. It depends upon how many questions you guys pepper me with, but there's some interesting stuff in the second paper, so whether I get through one paper or two papers or 1.5 papers is kind of up to you guys, but do bear in mind that there's some interesting stuff in the second paper. So I want to start with this quotation from Albert Szent-Györgyi, who discovered vitamin C. He said, research is looking at what everybody else has looked at, but seeing what nobody else has seen. And I bring up this quotation because, you may have seen the title for the presentation and thought, oh my God, what do we need the 20,000th study on first mover advantage for? This is an old topic. We've seen this before. Very, very long-standing topic in the research in strategy, marketing, economics, etc. Why do we need to see yet another paper on this topic? Well, I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to say that, this is a piece of research according to this definition, that this has really looked at a topic that really everybody else has looked at, but sees in it something that nobody else has seen. So, the two papers that I'm going to try to fit into this time are first a theory paper and then an empirical paper which is closely aligned with that theory paper. So the theory paper, again, is co-authored with Kubilai. It's called First Mover Advantages versus First Mover Benefits. What's the difference and why does it matter? This paper is currently under third round of review at Academy of Management Review. So let me just give you the brief overview because I know not everybody can stay for the full presentation, so I'm going to kind of give you the essence of the paper here in one slide so that if you need to leave early, you'll at least get the idea. So I'm going to talk first about the motivations and goals of the paper. I'm going to draw a distinction between what we call first mover advantage and first mover benefit. And they differ from each other because of differences between firms. There's interfirm heterogeneity, and also because of the endogeneity of entry order. Firms basically have some choice about whether they enter an industry, enter a market first, second, third, or whatever. And I'm going to talk about some of the empirical, conceptual, and managerial implications of this difference. And so the research question here is really going to be, how are these two concepts differ? And how are they both, and the difference between them, affected by interfirm heterogeneity and by other kind of market level contingency factors? We're going to consider three forms of interfirm heterogeneity that might drive a wedge between first mover advantage and first mover benefit. Those are heterogeneity in the firm's ability to create value, heterogeneity in the firm's ability to preemptively create value by being first into a market, and information asymmetry. Also going to look at a few market level contingency factors. And so the issue that's going to come up here is what biases result when the observed first mover advantage is used as an empirical proxy for the unobserved first mover benefit. And we're going to derive some propositions about that from a formal dynamic economic model. So let me say a few words about this distinction between first mover advantage and first mover benefit. So let me tell you about where this project came from. So Kubilai came to me in his first year in the program, and he said, he wanted to do a research project with me. And at the time he said what he was really interested in was high-tech markets, fast-moving high-tech markets. And I said, okay, I do economic modeling, so is there some kind of distinctive feature of these high-tech markets that we can do some modeling of? And we hit upon the idea of network externalities. Of course, you guys are familiar with the idea of network externalities. And I said, okay, putting on my Murray Davis hat, I said, okay, well, what is the conventional wisdom about network externalities that we can seek to overturn, right? Where can we find something interesting to say about network externalities? And of course, the conventional wisdom is that network externalities provide a first mover advantage because the first mover in an industry with network externalities has a head start in accumulating a user base, in accumulating an installed base of users. And so we said to ourselves, okay, well, maybe there's some circumstances where that's not true, or maybe there's some circumstances where the opposite is true, where maybe being a first mover doesn't help, or maybe even hurts in terms of your ability to exploit network externalities. And so we started working on this, and he and I did the initial work independently. He was doing some modeling on his own. I was doing some modeling on my own. And then we came back together and we compared notes on our results, and we had completely different results. And we were wondering, what's going on here? Why is it that your results say something so different than my results? And Kublai took the results back, and he studied them for a while and came back to me and he said, Rich, we're defining first mover advantage differently. He said basically that he was defining in his modeling work, he was defining first mover advantage as the performance difference between the first mover in an industry and the second mover, the actual second mover who follows that first mover in. And I was defining first mover advantage. So his way of doing it was an actual comparison. Actual comparison of the performance of the actual first mover to the actual second mover. And I was defining it as a counterfactual comparison. I was defining it in terms of the performance of the first mover versus the performance that that same firm would have gotten as a follower instead of a first mover. Right? So we were defining the concept differently. And after talking it through, we said, this network externalities thing, that's nice, but that's not the interesting thing about this paper. The interesting thing about this paper is the difference in the way that we're defining first mover advantage. So just to spell it out here, if we can think of there being a duopoly, two firms in an industry, firm A and firm B. And we're looking at their performance, right? And there's obviously two possible entry order scenarios in a duopoly like this. You could have scenario little a, where firm A enters before firm B. Or you could have, and in which case, I'm going to label firm A's performance as Y big A little a, and firm B's performance as Y big B little a, right? Then the other scenario would be scenario little b, where firm B enters before firm A. And here I'm going to label the performance as of firm A as Y capital A little b, and the performance of firm B as Y capital B little b. Everything clear so far? We're good? We're good? Okay, good. So what Kublai was doing was thinking about a comparison across the columns in this matrix, right? He was thinking about first mover advantage as the actual observed comparison between two firms' performance, two different firms' performance in one entry order scenario. And so notice that these two are different across the rows, right? So firm A's first mover advantage is the difference between those two, and firm B's first mover advantage is the difference between those two. I, on the other hand, was thinking about a comparison down the columns, right? And so we have come to label this now as first mover benefit, just to give it a distinctive name from first mover advantage. And that is the counterfactual comparison, usually unobservable, between one firm's performance across two entry order scenarios, right? So how would firm A do if it entered first versus if it entered second? And how would firm B do if it entered first versus if it entered second? And one thing I'm going to point out here is that both first mover advantage and first mover benefit are firm specific constructs, yes?
So Rich, are you assuming that firms are making optimal choices?
We'll get to that in a moment. So what I'm going to do in the model is I'm going to assume when we're looking at first mover advantage that they are making optimal choices, and when we're looking at first mover benefit that the entry order is set exogenously, okay? So endogenous, we're going to be looking at endogenous choices in first mover advantage. We're going to be looking at exogenous choices in first mover benefit. We good? Okay. So what did I want to say about this? So both firm A and firm B can have different first mover advantages. Well, they obviously can have different first mover benefits, right, because they're different firms. But they also can have different first mover advantages. And you might think, okay, well, is this just a problem of a measurement problem, or is this just an identification problem? For reasons I'm going to explain in a moment, I think not. I think it actually is deeper than that. It's not just a matter of measurement problem or an identification problem. It's actually a conceptual problem. So let me talk about why that is. Okay, so there's some implications. First of all, in most cases, the first mover advantage is different than the first mover benefit. Really, the first mover advantage is the pioneer's advantage over a different firm, the follower, and first mover benefit is the benefit that a given firm gets from going first rather than going later. They differ because they compare the pioneer's performance to two different benchmarks, two different standards, either to the performance of an actual follower or to the firm's own performance, counterfactual performance, if it did not pioneer. And the two are only equal to each other if the firms are kind of ex-ante identical, right? If the pioneer and follower don't have any ex-ante asymmetries. And the two standards two benchmarks that we're measuring against differ because of what you're saying, because of interfirm heterogeneity, right? The pioneer and the follower are different firms with different resources. Some resources may tend to help a firm when pioneering and hurt it when following, and vice versa. Other resources may help a firm's performance when following and may hurt when pioneering. Okay, so we get down to the question, okay, well, which one matters? Does first mover advantage matter, or does first mover benefit matter? Do both matter? What matters here? And our perspective on this question is that it depends upon your orientation and the question you're asking. It depends upon your orientation in time, specifically, and on the kinds of questions you're asking. So there's this classic Harvard Business Review article about decision-making going forward in reverse, very provocative title, which makes the following points. Now, I apologize for literally reading off of slides. I know that's the cardinal sin of PowerPoint, but in this case, I don't really see any way around it. Einhorn and Hogarth say each decision is the outcome of a complex process that usually involves two different kinds of thinking: looking backward to understand the past and looking forward to predict the future. Thinking backward is largely intuitive and suggestive. It tends to be diagnostic and requires judgment. It involves looking for patterns, making links between seemingly unconnected events, testing possible chains of causation to explain an event, and finding a metaphor or a theory to help in looking forward. Thinking forward is different. Instead of intuition, it depends on a kind of mathematical formulation. The decision maker must assemble and weigh a number of variables and then make a prediction using a strategy or a rule, assessing the accuracy of each factor, and combining all the pieces of information. The decision maker arrives at a single integrated forecast. So what I'm going to say here is that whether first mover advantage or first mover benefit matters depends upon whether we're looking backward or looking forward. So if I am trying to retrospectively explain performance differences between firms that are already competing in a market, looking backward. And this is what we tend to do in strategy. People particularly who do research in what we call the resource-based view, or RBV. We retrospectively tend to try to explain the performance differences between firms that are already in a market. In that case, FMA is really what matters, right? It's the actual performance differences that matter. On the other hand, if we are looking forward, if we're trying to prospectively predict or prescribe when a firm should enter a market in order to maximize its performance, then really only FMB matters, right? Because it doesn't matter, if I'm trying to make a prediction about what to do going forward, it doesn't matter whether I beat the other guy. It matters whether I'm maximizing my own performance. Generally, it's what matters looking backwards is FMA. What matters mostly looking forward is FMB, right? Okay, and so there's some certain distinctions between the two according to these, different dimensions, right? What's the baseline we're comparing it against? What's the comparison between? What's the type of comparison? What's the temporal orientation? And so first mover advantage is useful for the purposes of diagnosis or explanation of things that have already happened, right? First mover benefit is useful in terms of prediction, decision making, and prescription. And so first mover advantage is primarily most relevant to empiricists and to analysts. First mover benefit, perhaps more interesting to strategists, consultants, and theorists like myself, which is kind of why I did it one way and Kublai did it the other way. Again, this is not merely an empirical problem and not merely a measurement problem or an identification problem. It is a conceptual problem as well because first of all, because there's ambiguity about the level of analysis. It's obvious, to your point, that FMB is idiosyncratic, right? It's firm specific because there's only one firm involved anyway, right? In that comparison. I'm only comparing to myself. But FMA might seem like a market level construct because it compares different firms in the market, pioneers versus followers. And in fact, empirical research has treated FMA as if it were a market level construct, as if it were a market characteristic, often referring to the pioneering effect as if the pioneering effect were equally available to any firm that wants it, right? Any firm that happened to enter first. But as I showed in my little table, FMA can be just as firm specific as FMB because both can differ according to which firm is the pioneer. There is an empirical problem here, obviously. The heterogeneity, interfirm heterogeneity, is compounded by the endogeneity, right? Entry order is at least partly an endogenous choice. I can always generally delay my entry, right? Firms that would improve performance by pioneering are more likely to pioneer. Firms that would improve their performance by following are more likely to follow. So whereas FMB is kind of, you can think of it as a pure treatment effect of the act of pioneering, FMA is more of a blend of the treatment effect with a self-selection effect. So it's the effect of being the pioneer, right? FMA is really the effect of being the pioneer combined with the effect of whatever pre-existing resources motivated you to be the pioneer, right? Which are two separate things. There's really no easy solution to this empirically. It's hard to measure FMB directly, but I'm going to discuss some possibilities later in the talk. And the second paper is going to be exploring one of those possibilities, which basically exploits a natural experiment where the licenses to enter an industry were assigned at random through a lottery. And that basically allows me to kind of measure this directly. It's generally hard to separate the treatment effect from the self-selection effect, but again, in the second paper, we do exploit the natural experiment of a licensed lottery that allows us to do that. There is the normative problem here, which is, can we make prescriptive claims based on FMA research? And to make legitimate normative claims, we really would need to know FMB, not just FMA. And that's hard. Like I said, it's hard to measure FMB. So almost always we're measuring FMA in some form or other. But prescriptions and normative claims about FMA based on FMA may be totally wrong because they're combining the treatment effect with the self-selection effect. And yet, the FMA research literature is one of the most prescriptive research literatures out there in the whole strategy field. So let me give you a couple of examples. In some cases, the prescriptions are right there in the title of the paper, right? The importance of being first, or when to lead and when to follow. Some cases, they're a little bit more hidden, right? These findings obviously have implications for management decision making, right? Or my good friend Will Mitchell, who says, you know, the implications for decision making are striking, right? And newcomer will be more likely to gain market share, but will be more likely to survive, will perform better, will be frozen out. So Will says will a lot, but basically there's a lot of prescriptive normative claims going on here. Provides a useful conceptual framework for managers facing entry strategic decisions. Model provides specific guidance with 3 particular implications. Model should act as a useful decision-making aid for managers, etc. Our analysis could be used as the basis for optimal entry timing analysis, right?
We don't publish in marketing anymore.
Okay, okay, fair enough.
There's a lot of marketing there.
Yes. Our findings have 3 implications for managers. What are the managerial implications? This study suggests several important managerial implications, etc. Right? But the truth is, you know, who knows whether any of those managerial implications are valid because they're based on FMA rather than FMB. So my research question here, is this difference between FMA and FMB big enough to matter? If so, when? How large is the divergence between FMA and FMB, and in what direction? Is FMA greater than FMB? Is FMA less than FMB? And when? When does it differ? When we treat FMA as a proxy for FMB, which basically is what the research literature does, are we overestimating FMB or are we underestimating FMB? If so, by how much? And what conditions affect the magnitude of this difference? How do firm level factors and market level factors affect FMA, FMB, and the difference between them? What conditions make FMA better or worse as a proxy for FMB? These questions are, of course, important but largely theoretical, and so we're going to approach them in a theoretical way. We're going to start by trying to answer them in theory. We're going to develop a formal economic model that allows us to conduct the hypothetical comparisons needed to answer these questions. Here are the firm-specific asymmetries that we're going to look at. The information asymmetry. I'm going to assume that there's, I'm going to label my 2 firms I and U, I for informed, U for uninformed. The firm I, the informed firm, privately observes the value of a demand shock, which I call X, in advance, before the rival firm, before firm U, the uninformed firm. So that's the information asymmetry. There's also a proprietary value creation potential parameter called delta, which you can just think of as competitive advantage, right? There's a difference between firms in how much value that they can create regardless of entry order. That's delta. It's the difference between firms and the amount of value that they create independent of entry order. I'm going to assume that positive values of delta favor firm I and negative values of delta favor firm U. I think of this as general competitive advantage. And then there's a proprietary preemption potential, which I'm calling lambda. And this is a difference between firms in the amount of value that they could create if they were to enter first. And so you can think of this lambda parameter as a firm-specific benefit to entering first, right? So there's a firm-specific benefit, and then there's a firm-specific benefit to entering first. And then there's just a non-firm specific benefit to entering first that's also in the model, which is not shown here yet. So here's the market contingency factors. There's just an overall amount of value creation that's possible in the industry. Basically difference between buyers' maximum willingness to pay and firms' average cost. There's the industry-wide preemption potential, and this fee parameter is kind of what the literature has been thinking of as first mover advantage, right? Is this idea that there's some benefit to entering first regardless of what firm enters first, right? That's what fee is. It's an incremental boost to value creation regardless of which firm enters first. And then we also have a market growth rate theta. It's a deterministic portion of the shift in the inverse demand function of course, there's also that random component, which is the demand shock X. And that's represented here as the market volatility, which is the standard deviation of that demand shock X. So these are the market level characteristics that we're going to be looking at as contingency factors. So here's the model timeline. Market exists for 2 periods. One firm enters in each period. Pioneer gets 1 period of monopoly before competition starts in period 2. Upon entry, the firm must make an irrevocable commitment to its fixed output level per period. For first mover benefit, the entry order is determined exogenously. For first mover advantage, the entry order is determined endogenously, and the pioneer is whichever firm would obtain a higher expected value from pioneering. We also look at 2 possible information structures. We have an asymmetric information structure as shown here in this timeline above, where we first in period 0 decide who's going to enter first. Whoever's the informed firm, not necessarily the first entrant, the informed firm observes the demand shock. The pioneer, whichever firm entered first, chooses its level of output. And then in period 1.5, between the 2 market periods, the uninformed firm also then observes the demand shock. And then we have another period of output in period 2. On the symmetric information case, I'm going to basically remove this period 0.5 box from the timeline above and instead assume that both firms observe the demand shock in period 1.5 simultaneously. And I'm going to do some comparisons between the asymmetric and the symmetric information cases in order to capture the effect of private information. For the uninformed firm U, I have a trade-off, right? Because there's an informational benefit to me as the uninformed firm to wait, because then I get to observe the demand shock before making my output commitment. But that trade-off doesn't apply to firm I, because firm I already knows the demand shock, so firm I doesn't have an informational reason to wait. Okay? Skip over the math if you're interested. It's in the appendix of the manuscript. So here's some propositions that come out of the model. First of all, I'm going to look at the effects on the difference between FMA and FMB. And both the proprietary value creation potential, that's the competitive advantage, and the proprietary preemption potential, say that 10 times fast, proprietary preemption potential have a positive effect on the difference between FMA and FMB. This proprietary preemption potential, again, is the firm-specific benefit from entering first. So if either of these is high enough, FMA gets bigger than FMB. If either of them is low enough, then FMB is greater than FMA. Yeah, that's what I just said. Okay. So a firm's proprietary capability causes FMA and FMB to diverge regardless of whether that capability depends upon the firm entering first, right? Regardless of whether the value creation potential it depends upon entry order here or doesn't depend on entry order, it still has a positive effect on this difference between FMA and FMB. What does that mean? That means if I'm an empiricist doing an FMA study, I cannot simply brush off and ignore this FMA-FMB divergence and imagine that there's no impact or no bias simply because simply by arguing that all the ex-ante asymmetries do not depend on entry order. That doesn't hold water, right? Regardless of whether the ex-ante asymmetries depend upon entry order, it's still going to cause a divergence between FMA and FMB. And in fact, the effect is actually, in our model, significantly stronger, 5 times stronger for the case where it doesn't depend upon entry order than for the case where it does depend on entry order. So again, you cannot simply brush off the FMA-FMB divergence empirically by arguing that all the ex-ante asymmetries in your empirical setting are independent of entry order, because in fact that actually enlarges the bias.
So just to clarify, all the deltas and the lambdas are known to everybody.
Yes.
When you use the word asymmetry, it's just the timing of the information provision.
No, I'm thinking of the asymmetries. I guess, yeah, I maybe should have used a different term than asymmetry for these. maybe I should have used heterogeneity for these, but I was using asymmetry interchangeably for both information asymmetry and these value creation asymmetries. So maybe that was unwise. Okay. Then the market level characteristics also have interaction effects with these. So the higher, the more munificent the environment, right? The more value creation potential there is in the industry, the stronger these effects are. The greater the industry-wide preemption potential, the lower these effects are. The greater the market growth rate, the stronger these effects are. So those sets of results looked only at the difference between FMA and FMB. Now, if I break out FMA and FMB separately, I can see that one interesting effect is this interaction effect between market growth rate and these value creation potentials. Is positive in one case but negative in the other case. Positive for FMA, negative for FMB. I don't fully understand this. But I just mention it because it's a contrast between the two. I still have to figure this out. And then finally, the results having to do with information asymmetry. Having an informational advantage increases your difference between your FMA and your FMB, especially when the market volatility is high. Okay. So caveats and limitations. Yes, this is a very oversimplified model because it's a first cut. Nobody's looked at the difference between FMA and FMB before. And so it's oversimplified in a number of ways. George mentioned exit. We also had the lack of investment, right? So there's a single commitment mechanism, the fixed output level. There's an undifferentiated product. There's only two firms. There's only two time periods. There's no exit, no diversification. It's a generic preemption mechanism. There's only one advantage to the follower, which is being able to respond to the shock more effectively, and only one form of information asymmetry. Future models can and should relax these constraints. Okay? Now, in terms of measuring FMB, as I mentioned, this is hard. Now, there have been some attempts in the marketing literature particularly to use sophisticated econometric techniques to measure FMB indirectly by controlling for endogeneity. However, these efforts have produced mixed results, sometimes saying it matters, sometimes saying it doesn't matter, and it still doesn't handle the conceptual problem that the pioneering effect really isn't the pioneering effect. It really is firm specific. You could do stock market event studies on some weird situations where a firm may announce a delay in pioneering a new market. An example of this just came up today. My dad mentioned to me that he had booked passage on a cruise ship. That obviously he's probably not going to be taking that cruise now that the coronavirus has this outbreak. But he said that this was a brand new cruise ship and it was going to be the maiden voyage of this cruise ship, right? So if there was something like that where the firm had kind of pre-committed to pioneer a new market, but then some random shock comes along and forces them to delay, right? That could be a mechanism for directly measuring FMB. Lab experiments on simulated industries, of course. Field experiments using, I love this one, using post-disaster micro-lending to control entry timing. So there were these economists, actually, after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, who hooked up, I think it was with the World Bank or something like that, one of these international aid agencies that was going to do micro-lending to the entrepreneurs in these affected areas, in these demolished towns and villages, to help them restart their businesses. And these economists said, terrific. And obviously they didn't have enough money to make these microloans to everybody who wanted them. So these economists said, okay, will you let us randomize it? And then we can use that to kind of run some experiments to understand the effect of resource constraints, right? Well, that's great, but that same technique could also be used to measure entry order, because you could do the micro lending in waves, right? You could have one wave where the first set of disaster recovery loans go out 1 year, and then a second wave where they go out the second year. Another one would be, hey, look, we all live in universities. Universities often, especially Purdue, do new construction, building new buildings, sometimes whole new campuses. And so if you had a friendly university administration that might let us control the entry timing of certain businesses that were located in the university construction, restaurants or bookstores or whatever, then you could potentially do experiments there.
Chick-fil-A.
Chick-fil-A, exactly. Or, and this was the one that we really hit upon, was natural experiments based on the allocation of licenses by a random lottery, which is what we did in the second paper. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move quickly to that second paper. So first of all, did I fulfill this quotation? Did I look at something that everyone else has looked at but see what nobody else has seen? I see some nods around the room, so I'm hoping I've done that. So Kublai and I, so the story of the second paper goes like this. Kublai and I, once we had this first paper written up, we said, well, you know, how could you directly measure first mover benefit? Is there some way? And we thought, okay, well, it would have to be a situation where the entry order was determined exogenously. And we thought, okay, well, that could happen with licensing, for example, right, where you have to get a government license to enter the industry. And then we thought, well, you know, that's not good enough because that could still be endogenous, right? There could still be endogeneity in the licensing process and the behavior of regulators or whatever. What we really need is a situation where the licenses are assigned randomly, you know? And the phrase license lottery popped into our heads, and we went on Google and we typed in license lottery, right? And most of the results that popped up were garbage. It was like how to get a license to sell lottery tickets and stuff like that. We ignored that, but as we scrolled down, we came upon a New Yorker magazine article, this New Yorker magazine article, which says there was a PhD student in mathematics in Washington State University. His advisor told him, hey, look, the state needs our help. The voters had just approved legalization of recreational marijuana, and the state was preparing to issue licenses to marijuana retailers. It had set a cap, the state set a cap of 334 licenses statewide, but the state received more than 2,000 applications to open stores. Now, if this was a conservative state like Indiana, right, these licenses would have been auctioned off, right, because that would have put them in the guaranteed putting them in the hands of the people who can do the most with them, right, and also would have maximized revenues to the state. But of course, this is the state of Washington, which, you know, swings a little further left, and therefore the officials had a different criteria. The officials wanted a fair and random way of handing out the golden tickets. The idea is use a lottery. So this turned out to be the perfect natural experiment for us. The Washington State Marijuana Retailer Licensing Lottery worked like this. In 2014, out of those 2,000 applications, they did a screening process, and 1,174 of the applicants survived the screening process. But again, there was 334 licenses which were allocated across 122 jurisdictions in proportion to their population. For 75 of those 122 jurisdictions, there were more applicants than licenses available. So in those cases, in those jurisdictions, the same accounting firm that runs the state lottery held a double-blind random lottery to determine who got the licenses in those jurisdictions. And 2 years later, in 2016, the state authorized an additional 222 licenses. It gets even better because these new licenses were set aside to be given to the losers from the lottery in 2014. So both batches of retailers, both the 2014 batch and the 2016 batch, they were drawn from the same applicant pool. The only difference between them was randomization. Some got drawn to go early and some got to go in late. But what makes this even better is that the state posts on their website, the regulators, each store's monthly revenues by store. So, you know, starting from when the first store opened its doors. So we have a performance metric readily available. Eventually we're going to look at not just sales or market share, but sales per square foot as well, because we've, through a Freedom of Information request, we've gotten the store leases for a subset of the stores, and so we can find out their square footage of the stores. One of the things that we haven't done yet is that in addition to posting the store's monthly revenues online, this state is wonderful. They also post their inspections database, every inspection that they've done of every store, and what the results of those inspections were, and their violations database, right? So anytime there's been a violation, they know that. One of the things that they issue violations for is failure to install an adequate security system. So, alarm system or security system. So eventually we're going to look at that violations data and try to determine, for example, if the late movers do more cheating to try to catch up to the early movers, right? So it's just a wealth of data. And the natural experiment is just so beautiful because they're both batches are drawn from the same pool. And the only difference between them is the randomization of the timing. We found that there was indeed a first mover benefit with this data. And when we first submitted the manuscript to SMJ, we had this really triumphalist attitude. We were really, we are the champions. We finally solved this problem of endogeneity in the first mover advantage literature. How wonderful. And the reviewers were like, yeah, not so much. The reviewers were like, we're not so impressed because, it's very industry specific and not generalizable. So we looked into two possible mechanisms. One was preemption of locations, right, of prime locations. And you would think that this would be very important in retailing, location in retailing, as they say. And especially in this case because there were pretty severe restrictions on advertising for these stores. So it was not really easy for people to find the stores. They couldn't advertise on broadcast media. They couldn't advertise in public transit. And also any outdoor advertising they had to be no more than 1,600 square inches, which was a little bit larger than the size of a do not enter sign. So it's not like you could even put up a big sign to be seen from a long distance, right? So we thought, geographic preemption of prime geographic locations might be the mechanism. Turned out no, had no effect. But what did have an effect was online reviews, accumulation of online reviews, mediated about 50% of the effect.
Were prices regulated right at the end?
I don't think so. I think they're allowed to set their own prices. Now, one thing that was regulated was vertical disintegration. The stores are not allowed to grow or process their own products because, of course, the state of Washington, being suspicious of antitrust considerations, wanted to limit vertical integration. And so the same products are available basically from all the stores. So here's one thing. So we use online reviews from the Leafly website, which is a website that does cannabis store reviews. So I went on Leafly and I said, okay, here's a location in Seattle, in the middle of Seattle. Where are the nearest stores? And it came up with these 7 stores. So if you look at these reviews, which store would you pick?
More dispensaries.
Pardon? Have a heart? Why have a heart? 1,000 reviews, right? Now notice, it doesn't have the highest number of stars. That would be up here with Oz, recreational cannabis, has a 4.9. These guys have only a 4.8, right? But the problem you see here is that almost all the reviews are 4- and 5-star reviews, right? So there's really no information in the average number of stars. Really all the information is in the number of reviews. And the marketing folks actually have a term for this. They call it imbalanced reviews.
So this is after they've consumed the product that they reviewed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's all 4-star and 5-star reviews, right? Because if the sole purpose of your product is to put your customers in a good mood, they're going to write good reviews, right? There's this pioneer main effect if you exclude everything else. if you include the log review share in the jurisdiction, then that main effect disappears, and it becomes clear that the pioneer effect is mediated through that log review share. And it's a mediating effect, but it's not a moderating effect, because when we included the interaction, it was insignificant. Anyway, that's all I got. Thank you. An honor, a privilege. Thank you very much.
So we'll have refreshments